Catching that one expiring.
There's been a shooting outside the parking lot, Jason's Deli and Pavilion Shopping Center. I saw a young lady get shot.
She was shot?
There was two individuals, a man and a lady.
And she was shot?
Oh, they're still shooting, sir. Please, send somebody back.
She was on the ground. Her legs and arms. Like if you kill a cockroach. And I was always weak. I couldn't get even. So I would say, this time, I got even.
A deadly shooting tonight in the parking lot of this local shopping center. Authorities say two of the gym's employees were gunned down after closing for the night. JC Escamilla, who was escorting Maggie McCombs to her car, died instantly. 21-year-old Maggie McCombs is in critical condition.
There was a brief scuffle. The suspect apparently was trying to get to a gun that was in his waistband. Officers subdued him, and they brought him downtown for questioning.
Hey, Q, tell us what happened. What happened there? Can you tell us what happened? Tell us about the girl.
Here, you go ahead and have a seat right there. Welcome to the San Antonio Police Department. Mr. Masaki, can you tell me why you're here tonight?
I was a suspect.
You were a suspect?
Yeah.
In what?
What happened tonight?
Two people were shot?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know who those people were?
Only one. A girl. Maggie Coleman.
Who did you shoot first, Maggie or this guy?
It was two cars. They were kind of in between. I walked. They noticed. And I pulled my gun and I shoot. Then they two split. I started running to the right-hand side on the car. And then I saw him go in the hood. They got him, but my main target was the girl, so I was keep running. So I point, and he got her. Well, I don't know the right words, but maybe miracle to get her.
Like a lucky shot?
Lucky shot.
Some people, if they have blood on them, want to show it off, but he never brings it up. These external things in the world don't really concern him. He views people as separate and distant from himself in the world.
He's totally matter of fact, as if they're not talking about a shooting of two human beings. It's really more like, hey, I went out hunting for her and I caught her. That's very consistent with psychopathic behavior. He just has no value for human life.
She fell off from the front. She turned. She was on the ground. Her legs and arms. Like if you kill a cockroach, you know, she was just like that. Then I saw that guy on the ground. I saw him breathing from the hands. I just shoot him. And I get on my car and I left. I went to a restaurant and eat.
Did that bother you at all to go eat after you've shot two people?
No. I'm not the person.
He's trying to tell her, I'm fine. People who suffer from psychopathy know that they are different. He's discussing it as he would any other topic and without any sadness or any anger or any excitement. It's simply a description of events.
So if there was any doubt for me initially about his choice of words to talk about a lucky shot and it being a language barrier, I think the fact that he just equated one of his victims to a cockroach and went to eat after he shot both of them and wasn't bothered and very matter-of-factly says, I wasn't the one who was injured, that's very consistent with psychopathic behavior. He's pretty criminally oriented. This is somebody who doesn't have a lot of desire to follow the rules and the social expectations that the rest of us do, that we don't harm other human beings.
What did you shoot her with?
Springfield, 9mm.
Why did you buy a gun?
I wanted to shoot her.
Okay, you bought it specifically so you could shoot her?
Umasaki doesn't BS and doesn't lie because it has no meaning. There's no thrill in it for him to lie to the police officer. He represents one of the more extreme forms of psychopathy in that he doesn't even derive pleasure from his interactions.
How about now that you've done this? Are you able to kind of look back on it a little bit?
I didn't like this life. I always told my mom that I wish I wasn't born. I said I hate her because she gave me birth. I wanted to die. I was scared to kill myself.
You don't like yourself?
I don't like my life. I'm not happy.
Masaki is asked a question and he turns himself into the victim. This is somebody who has a lot of self-loathing. He looks depressed, he sounds depressed. This is somebody who just doesn't have a lot of purpose.
Not only is there no point to Masaki's life from his own viewpoint, there's no point to anyone else's life either.
Are you from San Antonio?
No.
Where are you from?
Japan.
And how old were you when you moved to the States?
19.
Your mom?
She's from Colombia.
And your dad, is he from Japan?
Mm.
Okay. When's the last time you saw your dad?
13.
Okay. So your mama brought you to the States?
I got a green card. I see people that are laughing. They're always together. And I was just by myself. No one wants to talk to me. I don't know why. I'm always nice. I never had a girlfriend. People just see me like we are the person. Like, he doesn't speak English very well. In Japan, my brother said, I'm gonna be a criminal. I never good at working. I never good at school. And I started to make myself believe that this is my fate.
Masaki's own brother identified when they were children that he was different. He was having problems then. He was showing antisocial behavior then, enough so that his brother said to him, "You're going to be a criminal."
He's definitely blaming society for not accepting him. But we can't attribute all of his feelings about life, the universe, and everything to just being in the United States and not speaking English as well as everyone else. In trying to understand why do people become psychopaths, we do think about the chicken and egg problem. So the nature-nurture dynamic of what were we born with in life and how did early experiences shape or enhance or reduce those capacities. There are some people who may be born with some biological characteristics that predispose them to psychopathy.
I think no one likes me. So, I'm a bad person. I always get humiliated. People laugh at me. That girl only common will laugh at me too. I couldn't get along with her.
You know she was laughing at you, or you think she was laughing at you?
I don't know. Maybe I don't understand the reality. I had someone say, you get paranoid.
Is that true?
I don't know, I'm not scientific. But I always felt I'm strange.
It's interesting that the detective pushes him a little bit on that and says, do you know that she was laughing at you? He kind of says, I don't know. He holds these wounds so strongly to himself and clearly uses them as his justification for how he's ended up here. He experiences a level of rage or anger or chronic rejection, and he doesn't really have the skills to work through those emotions. So then the emotions just build up and build up and build up, and it may very well have come bubbling up at the point that Maggie McCombs rejected him.
Why did you shoot that person?
Hated.
You hated her? What did she do that made you hate her?
Broke my heart.
That hurt your feelings.
It was not my first time to get dissed, but especially this girl.
He said many people have dissed him, but she did, and this time he got even. And so it was either just it was just a numbers count. I've been dissed so many times, I've reached my snapping point, and that's it, right? Or she was the one he didn't think would.
How would you feel if she was dead?
People always say things to me. And some people hit me, and I was always weak. I couldn't get even. So I would say, this time, I got even.
And how about this young man? How do you feel about him if I were to tell you that he was dead?
I don't know him.
Why did you shoot him?
Boyfriend?
He was a boyfriend. Do you know this to be a fact, or you just think that?
Well, just dancing, kissing and stuff.
You saw them kissing?
I just saw him today, so I don't know.
Okay.
Something really hard for me is easy for him.
He's saying, I can't make this work, so why should you? This was his idealized woman, and the other guy just represents the deficits that he struggles with. He represents the example of what I'm not, so it reminds me of how much I can't do, so I'll shoot him.
Friends and investigators say Masaki was obsessed with Maggie McCombs and had been stalking her for more than a year. He'd shown up to her front door at home and was eventually told to never come back to this Planet Fitness after his repeated, quote, extremely aggressive advances were turned down by Maggie.
I was in the gym. I saw her, I talked to her. She was nice.
Did you fall in love with her?
Mm-hmm.
Did she love you back?
Mm-hmm.
So she didn't love you back.
Mm-hmm.
Did she know that you wanted to kill her?
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever tell her that?
Mm-hmm.
You just kept it to yourself?
Mm-hmm.
It might seem like a bit of a paradox, so how could he long after this woman if he's at the extreme end of psychopathy with no empathy? And that's because it's about the world inside his head. It's not really about a relationship with her. It's whatever she represents inside his head.
They didn't go out socially, they weren't friends. He wouldn't have had many opportunities outside of his own stalking behavior to learn who Maggie was. So to say that he's in love with her, he's in love with the concept. He's in love with an obsession.
What did that accomplish by shooting her?
It's not sad anymore.
Does your mama know what you did today?
No, I don't really need to talk to her.
You don't need to talk to her?
She gave me this life. This life sucks.
His comments carry that feeling of this existential recognition of the emptiness and meaninglessness of life. I think this represents that psychopathic disconnectedness.
Misaki really is helping to connect the dots for us, that some of his rage and his anger and feeling rejected by Maggie stems from his anger at his mother.
Soy detective Bernal. ¿Cuándo fue la última vez que vio a su hijo?
Pero yo lo vi, ¿cuánto hace por ahí? Que fue unos 15 días, algo así.
¿No ha tenido él problemas con nadie recientemente que usted sepa?
No, que yo sepa. Pues, amigos, él casi no tenía amigos. No es de aquí realmente, entonces a raíz de eso, pues yo creo que se siente un poco apartado, ¿no?
Entonces, él no es, me dice que es pacífico, no es violento.
Pues mire, conmigo, mientras yo o sea, no le lleve la contraria, porque yo ya vengo con esto desde el papá. Está bien, nunca le decía que no, a nada. O sea, no se les puede llevar la contraria.
So this is a psychiatric evaluation that was performed on Misaki after the shooting and the murder. His mother allowed him to do what he wanted because of his reactivity when he did not get his way. He admits to not speaking and having outbursts of anger, many times directed to his mother since childhood. The outburst of anger would sometimes be destructive, destroying property, or threatening harm. Sometimes it was directed to self, banging his head against a wall. Sounds like maybe she was frightened or she didn't want to have to deal with the demonstrations of anger. But he learns, I get what I want by insisting. And we see that in his behavior with Maggie. She keeps saying no, but he goes, no, I'm just persisting. I'm going to get what I want. And that feeds right into that obsession with her.
Pero sí tiene muchos comportamientos parecidos al papá. Mi marido, porque le aporreaba muy horrible. Y era una persona muy, como uno dice, es muy, pues, no es amable, ¿cierto? No era amable conmigo. Porque, empezando porque como ellos tuvieron otros problemas, ¿cierto? Pues, como de niños que veían que el papá me aporreaba, ellos se escondían, siempre cuando eran pequeñitos se escondían detrás de mí. Y a mí me daba miedo de mi marido porque él cuando me agarraba me golpeaba. Y yo me escondía y yo le tenía miedo y ellos también. Cuando eran niños y ellos crecieron, ¿cierto? Con miedo. O sea, son unos niños que la niñez fue muy traumatizada.
You get a little window into what kind of behavior might have been modeled for him by his father. That it was okay to treat women this way, and it was okay to not tolerate rejection, and you should always get what you want. Children that grow up around violence learn to use it as problem solving.
And if we happen to be biologically predisposed to psychopathy, it just shunts us down that road even further. So it's possible with Misaki that his early experience simply gave him a further kick in the direction of being distant, aloof, separate, not needing as much of a relationship from other people.
I remember everything pretty well. Details. There's days where I wake up and I just kind of wonder why this happened. I wanted to make it through this, and I wanted to be able to live and just have the life that I've always wanted.
28-year-old Yu Masaki flashes a smile before shuffling up to the judge, ready to enter pleas for the murder of 31-year-old J.C. Escamilla and aggravated assault of 21-year-old Maggie McCombs.
How do you plead guilty, not guilty, or no contest?
Guilty.
Throughout the interrogation, he is flat. There's no emotion. But here, Yu Masaki, we see him sauntering up to the judge's bench. It's the most emotion we've seen out of him so far. He's smiling. He's suddenly important. He's relevant. People see him, people hear him, and I think that's ultimately what Yu Masaki was after, and he got what he wanted.
Are you sorry that you shot these people, Mr. Masaki?
Well, of course, I wish the life was different. Like, why can't we all just get along?
Help me, please. I need help. I don't know where my parents are. Some people broke into our house. Okay, please. Dad? Someone broke in and I heard shots like pop. I don't know what's happening. I'm tied upstairs.
You're tied?
I had my cell phone in my pocket.
Someone invaded your home now?
Yes.
You
and
heard gunshots?
They had guns and they were holding me at gunpoint.
Who's to say this whole thing isn't a lie? Because if you are lying, it's the most cold-blooded thing that I've ever faced in my life. There is nothing that you've said to me today is a lie.
The sense of security in this Markham neighborhood has been shaken. The night of November the 8th, 3 men forced their way into the home. They demanded money and fired shots. Police continue to search for these 3 suspects.
Her mother, 53-year-old Vic Ha, was shot and killed. Father, 60-year-old Han, was left with a critical head wound.
24-year-old daughter Jennifer escaped unharmed and was the one to call 911.
Just close that door for me. Tell me about your day.
I upstairs in my room, called it a night with the TV on. And I believe that was around 9:30 or so. Suddenly I could hear the voices weren't any voices I was very familiar with. And so I was scared and I couldn't move. I peered out of my bedroom door. And a guy was there and he came at me and had string in his hands and tied my arms back and said, I have a gun behind your back. Do what I say. If you do what I say, then no one will get hurt. Where is the money? Show me where your money is.
How much money did you turn over to them?
At least $1,100.
And where would that have been?
In my mom's bedside table.
And you saw them? Did they go into that bedside table?
Then they dragged me down the stairs and made me kneel at the bottom, telling me to face down on the floor while the other guy had a gun behind my head, and asked my mom where her purse was. They were trying to find her wallet, but they kept pushing her down onto the chair.
Okay. Take your time. Take your time. All this is very important, so take your time.
They kept all the lights off on the main floor. The only time there was light was when they opened the fridge door to see if they could find where my mom's purse was. At that point, I saw 3 figures of men. One of the gentlemen asked my father if he had money in his wallet and where his wallet was.
She calls them gentlemen. It raises concerns for me. You know, when I see that, it's an odd choice of words.
Either she's careless about the way she uses words, or she has some affiliation, some reason to treat the men with more courtesy than you should treat a killer.
They took me up the stairs and they tied me to the top of the banister. Just with one string, I could still move, but I was afraid to because the one guy just had that gun. Just the last things I heard them say was, "You lied to us. You lied to us." And then I heard 2 pops. My mom screamed. I yelled out for her. And a couple more pops. And then they ran out the door.
She's trying to be emotional, and crossing her arms in front of her chest says, look, I've been victimized, but the clarity of her thought is inconsistent with the body language. She's still very clear-minded.
I've worked with hundreds of women who've been in violent situations, and when you're recounting something this horrible so soon after, sometimes you're numb, sometimes you're hysterical. Her matter-of-fact tone is a reflection of the rehearsal. She's rehearsed this.
And at that point, they had my phone on me, behind me, that I had hidden there that they didn't know about. I whipped up the phone and I called 911. But I still hadn't heard anything from my mom, and all I could hear was my dad running on the street, just moaning and making sounds.
What, in your opinion, would cause people to target your house to think there was a large quantity of money?
I'm not sure.
Now, you say your mom drives a Lexus.
It could be because of the aesthetics, yes.
What about your dad?
He drives a Mercedes and he loves that baby.
He loves that baby. I think it's a slip. It could be that her father has displayed more love toward his car than toward her, and that there's some resentment on her part about that.
I find it interesting that she used the word aesthetics. So she's already saying her parents' life is fake.
Police have released this grainy video taken from a neighbor's security camera. It may be the suspect vehicle, and investigators are hoping that someone may be able to identify it. It's not clear at this time what was taken from the home.
I'm going to try and ask you questions to try and clarify points, okay?
I'm just trying to, like, every time I think of those things, it gets me all worked up. But I have to think about it, but I don't want to. And it's just like I did it, I don't want to do it again.
Part of our job is to go back and look at what you've told us to try and match up to evidence that we have.
You made me, like, now I feel like I've said something wrong.
You have not, you have, to me, you've said...
No, I've said everything that I know that is true.
Yeah. So where does this phone go?
I stick it right here on the back side of my pants.
Back side of your pants?
Yes.
Stand up and turn around and tell me, just show on the camera, how your hands are bound and how you are against the railing. You don't have to sit down. I just need to see how you work.
Just tell me.
She's panicked. There's an interesting little girl sort of persona that she brings on. And I think she really believes she's a little girl who's helpless and needs help. And
at the same time using the helpless little girl to try to get sympathy.
Stand up and turn around. Put this in the side that you believe it was in. Put your hands behind your back, exactly how you remember they were. Okay? Now, how far can you move your hands from the banister?
They tied my upper arm
Yes?
around the banister,
Yes?
but my hands were bound together.
Okay, so now how can you get to the phone? And how do you make the phone call? (911). And do you talk down like that?
Yes, I'm yelling at the phone like this.
And how can you hear?
I turned the volume on max.
I guess you can take it two ways. You know, if this was legit, she wouldn't want to necessarily reenact the way she was tied up. But if it's not legit, then it's a pain for her to have to demonstrate something that probably never occurred. It's just part of a story. I don't know if she anticipated that this would happen, you know, but she's falling into the trap that most inexperienced criminals fall into, which is, you know, he's asking her a very straightforward, logical question, and her response, although she made a good attempt, it did seem contrived.
She's not quite believable. She was certainly reluctant to enact it.
What I want to do now is I want to go into your past. What do you do when you finish high school?
My father wanted me to become a pharmacist, doing something in the medical field that was successful.
Did you go to school for pharmacy? Did you get into university for pharmacy? So how is your home life with you're not living up to his expectations?
He didn't know. I lied to him.
What did you lie to him? What did you tell him?
That I was going to school.
So both your parents thought you had gone to university?
Yes. I felt guilty, but every time I tried to bring it up, there was just so much expectation.
She became completely enslaved by this fantasy that was not even hers. It was her parents'.
The first glimpse you have of her, you know, she seems like, almost like a child. So now we get to see that she's capable of definitely lying and fooling her parents. And she's also complaining about her parents on a certain level.
Do you have a boyfriend?
I had a boyfriend, but no, I don't have.
What was your boyfriend's name?
Daniel.
Daniel what?
Wong. I didn't really get to see him much. I wasn't allowed to have a boyfriend.
So you were dating him essentially without your parents' knowledge and consent?
Yes.
Did they ever find out that you were dating Daniel?
Eventually.
Well, how long into the relationship was that?
Say 5 years.
And how did that go?
Not well.
Explain to me what not well means.
They gave me an ultimatum to either choose Daniel or to choose them. I chose to stay home with my family.
You still have feelings for Daniel, don't you?
Yes. But unfortunately, I made a decision and I had to stick by it.
So tell me your relationship with Jen.
We were planning to stay together, but there was a big issue with her and her parents.
So, why would they hate you? You've been in trouble with the police, right?
Yeah. I've been in trouble with possession and trafficking.
I think most parents would be alarmed by your boyfriend whose sort of primary goal in life is to sell drugs, but particularly a strict family that has these high social status expectations. That probably was some part of her that could only be attracted to someone who was not like her parents. So someone who is rebellious, low achieving, that she associated with being free.
The night that this happened, Monday night, what were you doing?
I stayed at the store until about like 9:30, 10 o'clock.
Now, are you worried for your safety?
Yeah, like, I am. Like, I haven't slept. Just the shock, and it just kept on going through my head. Who could it be? Like, who is it? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know who is behind it, right? I just know that her parents didn't want us to be together. But she tried to stay in my life.
She tried to keep the fantasy of not disappointing her parents and the fantasy of this perfect boyfriend alive at the same time. But she couldn't do it.
You admittedly lied. You've lied to your parents about going to school. Who's to say this whole thing isn't a lie? Because if you are lying, it's the most cold-blooded thing that I've ever faced in my life. There is nothing that you said to me today is a lie.
At the end of the day, I love my parents and I chose to be with them. And if I wanted to, I could have just left, but I didn't. I wanted to stay with them and take care of them.
Imagine 5 years of deceiving people, deceiving friends, family, neighbors, everybody, to live in this fantasy. The fantasy was concrete and literal. I want to live with Daniel and be happy ever after, and I don't want to disappoint or anger my parents. You really need to dissociate from your emotions and your reactions in order to live in this fantasy.
Hanpan says he saw his daughter Jennifer untied, whispering back and forth with one of the intruders, and he described that conversation as soft and friendly. He says he could hear his wife begging for their daughter's safety. "Don't hurt her," she cried, and then the trigger was pulled.
You need to tell me what went on, because you know who was in that house that night. You do, Jen. There's no question about that. Your parents, their expectations weren't realistic, were they? You couldn't live up to them, could you? You tried to, right? Am I right? And finally, you had to bite back, right? What happened?
What happened?
You were part of setting this plan in motion. You were behind this.
What happened to me? What happened to me?
We're going to work through the case, okay? But we got to start.
What happened to me?
You can almost imagine her saying that line while she was deceiving her parents and being given ultimatums. But what about me? You see that self-indulgent, childlike narcissism, typical of psychopathy. There's a disconnect, I think, between trying to have her feet in both worlds and to reach the point where the only way to resolve the disconnect is to murder your parents speaks to her character pathology.
What happened? What? Okay. So we're supposed to take the whole family out?
No, just me.
How come it was supposed to be you?
Because I didn't want to be here anymore.
Why not?
Because I was such a disappointment. Everyone could be free from me. I was a disappointment in everything.
What did you want done?
Come in and take me out.
So why didn't they do it the way you wanted?
I don't know.
Psychopaths in general say whatever they need to say to get whatever it is they want. You know, I don't really think she wanted to die, and I certainly don't believe that she hired someone to come into her house to just kill her.
Why would somebody shoot someone they didn't have to shoot?
I don't know. I can't figure that out.
Okay, why didn't you tell us this that night then?
Because I was scared.
Scared of what? Telling the truth?
Yes. That I wanted to die.
I'm going to be arresting you for murder. Okay? Also attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder. You have to listen here, so can you take your hands off your ears?
You said that you were on my side.
Prosecutors claim Jennifer conspired with ex-boyfriend Daniel Wong, hiring 3 hitmen to carry out the attack.
During the 10-month trial, the jury heard Jennifer Pan had spun a web of lies. After 4 days of deliberations, a jury found Jennifer Pan and Daniel Wong guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder.
Maury Troy Travis was not supposed to be found the way he was. For years, he existed in the background of ordinary life, moving through the streets of St. Louis without drawing attention, living in a quiet neighborhood, holding everyday jobs, and presenting himself as someone unremarkable. To the people around him, he was not a person who appeared dangerous. He was not someone who openly displayed violence or gave obvious warnings that something terrible was hidden beneath the surface. But behind the walls of his home in Ferguson, Missouri, investigators would later uncover evidence of crimes that would shock the region and leave behind questions that would never receive complete answers. The case of Maury Travis became one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in the history of St. Louis, not only because of the number of women he was suspected of killing, but because of the way the investigation unfolded. Travis was not discovered through a confession, a dramatic confrontation, or a long pursuit by law enforcement. Instead, the person who ultimately helped investigators find him was Travis himself. His desire to demonstrate control, his need to reveal what he believed only he knew, and his decision to send a message to the outside world became the very actions that exposed him. The story of Maury Travis is therefore not only a story about a suspected serial killer. It is also the story of the women whose disappearances were initially overlooked, the investigators who attempted to connect scattered pieces of evidence, and a case that ended before many questions could ever be answered. Maury Travis was born on October 25, 1965, in St. Louis, Missouri. Public information about his early childhood is limited, and there is little available that explains the experiences that shaped him before adulthood. What is known is that, long before investigators connected him to multiple murders, Travis already had a criminal record. In 1989, he was convicted of armed robbery and sent to prison. He was released in 1994 after serving his sentence. Later, in 1998, he faced additional legal trouble involving drugs. By the time authorities began investigating the murders linked to him, Travis was already a person with a criminal history and was under supervision. Yet nothing about his public image suggested the scale of the crimes investigators would eventually associate with him. Travis lived in Ferguson, Missouri, with his girlfriend. He worked in service-related jobs, including positions connected to the hotel industry. Those who knew him described him as quiet and not particularly noticeable. He was not the type of person who immediately attracted suspicion from neighbors or acquaintances. Like many investigations involving individuals who commit serious crimes, the contrast between appearance and reality became one of the most unsettling elements of the case. The man people saw during everyday interactions was very different from the person investigators believed existed in private. During the late 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s, the St. Louis metropolitan area was facing significant social challenges. Poverty, addiction, homelessness, and street-level prostitution affected many communities. Within that environment, some women disappeared without receiving the same immediate public attention that might have followed the disappearance of someone with stronger social connections or greater public visibility. Many of the women later connected to Travis lived difficult lives. Some struggled with instability, and some were involved in street prostitution. Their circumstances made them vulnerable, not only to individuals who sought to harm them, but also to a system where their disappearances could be harder to recognize as part of a larger pattern. This vulnerability became one of the central themes in the investigation that followed. The women were not simply names in a case file. Each one had a life, relationships, and a personal history that existed before investigators ever began searching for answers. As the years passed, authorities began to see similarities among several cases. Women were disappearing from the St. Louis area, and some bodies were later discovered in locations connected to both Missouri and Illinois. At first, these incidents appeared to be separate tragedies, but gradually, investigators began considering the possibility that they were connected. The pattern suggested the presence of a single offender operating across state lines. Eventually, Maury Travis would become known by two names in connection with these crimes: the Streetwalker Strangler, reflecting the type of victims investigators believe he targeted, and the Bi-State Strangler, referring to the area spanning Missouri and Illinois, where the suspected crimes occurred. The investigation would later connect Travis to several women, including Alicia Greenwade, Betty James, Mary Shields, Cassandra Walker, Teresa Wilson, Verona Thompson, Yvonne Cruz, and Brenda Beasley. Authorities suspected the actual number of victims could be much higher. Travis himself claimed to have killed 17 women, though investigators could only confirm a portion of the cases. Estimates of the possible number of victims connected to him ranged from approximately 12 to 20. The uncertainty surrounding that number became one of the most haunting aspects of the case. There were questions about how many lives had been lost and whether there were additional victims whose stories had never been uncovered. One of the cases that became central to the investigation was the death of Alicia Greenwade. Her body was discovered in Illinois on April 1, 2001. At the time, investigators did not know that her death was connected to a larger series of crimes. Like many investigations, the search for answers began with a single victim and a single set of circumstances. It was only later, when additional evidence emerged, that investigators began to understand the possibility that Greenwade's death was part of a much larger pattern. Another important case was that of Betty James, whose body was discovered approximately 2 months later in Missouri. The similarities between the cases involving Greenwade and James helped investigators consider that they might not be dealing with unrelated crimes. Instead, they began to suspect that a serial offender could be operating in the region. However, at that stage, they lacked the direct evidence needed to identify a suspect. The investigation remained incomplete, and the person responsible continued to exist outside the focus of law enforcement. That would change because of one decision made by Maury Travis himself. In June 2002, a reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch received a strange letter. The sender claimed to have information about the murders and suggested knowledge that only someone involved could possess. The letter included a map and referred to what was described as victim number 17. It appeared to be an attempt to challenge investigators to prove knowledge of crimes that authorities had not yet fully uncovered. But instead of creating fear or confusion, the letter created a path for investigators to follow. The information contained within it provided clues that would eventually connect back to Travis. The map had been created through an online mapping service, and investigators were able to trace the digital source of that information back to a computer located inside Maury Travis's home. The technology Travis used in an attempt to demonstrate control became the evidence that pointed investigators toward him. On June 7, 2002, police moved forward with a search of Travis's home in Ferguson. What they discovered there would transform the investigation completely. Inside the residence, investigators found evidence that suggested Travis was not simply connected to one or two crimes, but potentially responsible for a much larger series of offenses. Among the evidence were restraints, items believed to have been used to control victims, personal belongings belonging to women, photographs, video recordings, and computer data. The discovery of the recordings was among the most disturbing moments of the investigation. The videos showed Travis documenting acts of violence against victims and provided investigators with evidence of planning, control, and direct involvement. The material found inside the home revealed a hidden reality that had existed behind the appearance of an ordinary life. Maury Travis had spent years presenting himself as a quiet individual living a normal existence. But inside his home, investigators found evidence that suggested something far more disturbing. The case that began with missing women and unanswered questions was now focused on one suspect. However, before investigators could fully understand the scope of what had happened, before families could receive all the answers they were seeking, and before the evidence could ever be presented in a courtroom, the case would take another unexpected turn. Maury Travis would never stand trial, and the final truth about the number of lives he had taken would remain uncertain. Before Maury Travis became a name associated with one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in St. Louis history, there were women whose lives had already been interrupted by violence. Their stories began long before investigators connected their disappearances to a single suspect. They were not merely pieces of evidence in a criminal case. They were daughters, friends, acquaintances, and individuals with personal histories that existed beyond the circumstances of their deaths. Understanding the Maury Travis investigation requires first understanding the environment in which these crimes occurred and the vulnerabilities that allowed a pattern to remain hidden for so long. During the late 1990s and early 2000s, the St. Louis metropolitan area faced a range of social difficulties. Parts of the region struggled with poverty, addiction, homelessness, and street-level prostitution. These problems affected many communities and created situations where some individuals lived outside the attention of the larger public. For women experiencing instability, life could become unpredictable. Some had limited support systems, some moved frequently, and some faced challenges that made it more difficult for authorities and families to immediately recognize when something was wrong. Within this environment, several women disappeared. At first, these cases appeared isolated. A missing person report might represent one individual, one family searching for answers, and one investigation with limited information. There was not immediately an obvious connection between the disappearances. The victims did not disappear from the same location, and there was no clear evidence at the beginning that one person was responsible. The idea that a single offender could be moving through the region targeting vulnerable women was not immediately apparent. Over time, however, investigators began noticing similarities. The cases shared elements that suggested a pattern. Women connected to the same general environment were disappearing, and some of their remains were later discovered in areas connected to Missouri and Illinois. As investigators reviewed information and compared cases, the possibility emerged that they were dealing with a serial offender operating across state lines. The women later linked to Maury Travis came from different backgrounds, but they shared one tragic circumstance. They became victims of someone who investigators believed deliberately targeted those who were less likely to receive immediate attention. Among the victims connected to the investigation was Alicia Greenwade. Her death became one of the central cases associated with Travis. On April 1, 2001, her body was discovered in Illinois. At the time, investigators did not know they were looking at a piece of a much larger investigation. Like many homicide cases, the initial focus was on determining what happened to one person. Investigators had to examine the evidence available, attempt to reconstruct the final moments of her life, and determine whether her death was connected to anyone known to her. The discovery of Greenwade's body was a tragedy in itself, but it would later become a critical part of a larger pattern. The investigation into her death eventually became connected to evidence discovered during the investigation of Maury Travis. The circumstances surrounding her case helped investigators understand that they were not dealing with an isolated crime. Another victim connected to Travis was Betty James. Approximately 2 months after Greenwade's body was discovered, James was also found dead in Missouri. The similarities between these cases began raising questions among investigators. 2 women had lost their lives under circumstances that suggested there could be a connection. The possibility that a serial offender was responsible became increasingly difficult to ignore. However, at that stage, authorities still lacked the evidence necessary to identify the person behind the crimes. They had victims, they had questions, but they did not yet have the suspect. Other women later linked to Travis included Mary Shields, Cassandra Walker, Teresa Wilson, Verona Thompson, Yvonne Cruz, and Brenda Beasley. Each name represented a separate investigation, a separate loss, and a separate story. When viewed individually, these cases might not have immediately revealed the larger picture. But together, investigators began to see a disturbing pattern. The suspected number of victims connected to Travis remains uncertain. Authorities believed he could have been responsible for far more crimes than those that could be confirmed. Travis himself claimed that he had killed 17 women. Investigators considered that possibility, but they could only establish a portion of the cases with available evidence. Estimates of his possible victims ranged from approximately 12 to 20. The uncertainty created one of the most difficult aspects of the case. Even after Travis was identified, investigators still did not know the full extent of what he had done. The absence of complete answers meant that some families may never know whether their missing loved ones were connected to him. This uncertainty is one of the lasting tragedies surrounding the investigation. The focus on vulnerable victims is an important part of understanding the case. The circumstances surrounding the women's lives were not responsible for what happened to them. Their struggles did not make their disappearances less important. Instead, their cases highlight the importance of recognizing every missing person as an individual deserving of attention and investigation. Serial offenders often exploit situations where victims are less likely to be immediately noticed. In the case of Maury Travis, investigators believed he used the vulnerability of these women to avoid detection. He targeted individuals who were less protected by social structures and who might not immediately generate widespread attention when they disappeared. This pattern allowed him to continue operating while investigators worked with incomplete information. The investigation would eventually reveal that Travis was not only connected to multiple deaths but had also preserved evidence of his actions. However, before that discovery, there was a period when investigators were still trying to understand the connection between missing women and recovered remains. They were attempting to answer fundamental questions. Were these cases related? Was one person responsible? How many victims were there? The answers would come only after a series of discoveries that began with the investigation into Travis's own life. While the victims' stories formed the foundation of the investigation, Maury Travis himself remained, for years, someone who appeared ordinary. He lived in Ferguson, Missouri, maintained relationships, and worked regular jobs. There was little outward indication of the crimes investigators would later associate with him. That contrast became one of the most unsettling elements of the case. The person investigators eventually focused on did not appear to match the image many people held of. Someone capable of committing multiple murders. He was not a stranger hiding in an unknown place. He was someone who existed within a community, someone who interacted with others while allegedly concealing a violent reality. As investigators continued examining the disappearances and deaths, they moved closer to understanding the connection between the victims and the man who would become known as the Bi-State Strangler. The case was no longer a collection of separate tragedies. It was becoming a single investigation centered on one question: who was responsible for taking these women's lives? The answer would lead investigators to the home of Maury Travis, where evidence would reveal a disturbing hidden world and transform a series of unanswered cases into one of the most shocking criminal investigations in St. Louis history. Before investigators entered the home of Maury Travis and uncovered the evidence that would define one of St. Louis's most disturbing criminal investigations, they had to understand the person behind the name. The question was not only what crimes had occurred, but who was the man connected to them? How could someone suspected of multiple murders live quietly in a community without attracting immediate attention? The investigation into Maury Travis revealed a troubling contrast between the person people saw in everyday life and the evidence that would later emerge from behind closed doors. Maury Troy Travis was born on October 25, 1965, in St. Louis, Missouri. Unlike some criminal cases where investigators can point to a clearly documented history of violence beginning in childhood or adolescence, the available information about Travis's early years is limited. There are few public details about his upbringing, his family life, or the experiences that shaped him before adulthood. What investigators did know was that Travis had already entered the criminal justice system before. He became connected to a series of suspected murders. In 1989, Travis was convicted of armed robbery. The conviction resulted in a prison sentence, and he remained incarcerated until his release in 1994. This was not the end of his legal problems. In 1998, he faced additional trouble involving drugs. By the time authorities began investigating the disappearances and deaths connected to him, Travis was not someone without a criminal history. He had already interacted with the justice system, and his past demonstrated that he had engaged in illegal behavior before investigators suspected him of far more serious crimes. However, his criminal record did not reveal the full extent of what investigators would later discover. The image of Maury Travis that existed in his community was not one of a person openly displaying aggression or threatening behavior. He lived in Ferguson, Missouri, in a home that appeared ordinary from the outside. He lived with his girlfriend and maintained a lifestyle that did not immediately draw suspicion from neighbors or acquaintances. He worked in service-related jobs, including employment connected to the hotel industry. To many people who encountered him, he was simply a quiet individual going through daily life. This ordinary appearance became one of the most unsettling elements of the case. The investigation demonstrated that a person can maintain a familiar public identity while allegedly concealing a completely different reality in private. There were no obvious public warnings that revealed the crimes investigators would later associate with him. He was not described as someone constantly causing disturbances or someone whose behavior immediately suggested danger. Instead, he blended into his surroundings. This contrast between appearance and reality would become a recurring theme throughout the investigation. For investigators, understanding Travis meant examining not only the evidence connected to specific crimes, but also the circumstances that allowed him to remain undetected. His ability to maintain a normal appearance may have contributed to the length of time authorities spent trying to identify the person responsible for the deaths of multiple women. The victims were often women who lived in difficult circumstances, and Travis's ability to appear ordinary may have helped him avoid suspicion while investigators worked through incomplete information. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, when authorities believed Travis was active. He was living in the same general region where many of the disappearances occurred. The St. Louis metropolitan area provided the setting for a series of cases that would later be connected. Investigators believed Travis targeted vulnerable women, many of whom were involved in street prostitution or dealing with personal struggles. His suspected victims were not random in the sense of being chosen without consideration. Authorities believed he selected individuals whose circumstances made them easier to approach and whose disappearances might not immediately produce the same level of public attention. This aspect of the case is one of the most important reminders of the investigation. The circumstances of a victim's life do not determine the value of that person's life. Each missing woman represented a family, relationships, memories, and a future that was taken away. As investigators began connecting cases, they had to look beyond assumptions and focus on evidence. The challenge was identifying patterns among victims whose lives had not always received significant public attention. The work required examining reports, comparing information, and determining whether separate incidents were actually connected. Eventually, the possibility emerged that the person responsible was not a stranger passing through the area, but someone who lived within the community. That realization changed the direction of the investigation. Maury Travis became the focus not because of rumors or appearances, but because evidence gradually began pointing toward him. Before that evidence was uncovered, however, Travis continued living a life that appeared routine. This is one of the reasons the case remains disturbing. The crimes investigators later associated with him were hidden behind the appearance of normality. The house where he lived did not immediately suggest the events that investigators would later discover inside. His daily interactions did not reveal what authorities believed was happening away from public view. The difference between his public identity and the allegations against him created a sense of disbelief for those who later learned the details of the investigation. For law enforcement, the process of identifying Travis required moving beyond assumptions about what a suspect should look like. The person responsible for serious crimes does not always match public expectations. He may have a job, relationships, and a familiar presence within a neighborhood. The investigation into Maury Travis showed how dangerous it can be when someone capable of extreme violence is able to hide behind an ordinary exterior. As investigators continued examining the deaths connected to the St. Louis area, they eventually began focusing on evidence that linked Travis to the victims. The investigation would soon move from questions about who might be responsible to a much more disturbing discovery: what had been happening inside his home. The search of Travis's residence would reveal the hidden side of his life and provide some of the strongest evidence in the entire case. Inside that house, investigators would find items that transformed their understanding of the crimes. They would discover that the case was not only about missing women and unanswered questions. It was about a suspected offender who had preserved evidence of his actions and left behind a record of what authorities believe he had done. The story of Maury Travis was about to enter its most critical stage. The ordinary image would disappear, replaced by the evidence hidden behind it. And once investigators saw what existed inside his private world, there would be no going back to the idea that Maury Travis was simply an unremarkable man living a quiet life in Ferguson. For investigators examining the disappearance and deaths of women connected to the St. Louis region, the turning point in the Maury Travis case came when separate pieces of information began forming a single, disturbing picture. For a long period of time, authorities were dealing with individual tragedies. Women had disappeared, bodies had been discovered, families were left with unanswered questions. But gradually, investigators began to see that these cases might not exist independently. The possibility emerged that they were connected by one person operating across Missouri and Illinois. The investigation was no longer only about determining what happened to individual victims. It became a search for a person who investigators believed had created a pattern of violence. Maury Travis would eventually become known as the Bi-State Strangler, a name reflecting the geographical area where the suspected crimes occurred. He was also referred to as the Streetwalker Strangler because many of the women connected to the investigation were believed to have been targeted while living vulnerable lives, including involvement in street prostitution. These names represented the investigators' attempt to describe the pattern they believed existed. But behind those labels were real individuals whose lives had been taken away. The suspected pattern was deeply troubling. Investigators believed Travis approached women who were vulnerable and easier to isolate. He was suspected of gaining access to them before taking them to private locations. According to the investigation, those encounters ended in violence. The victims were later discovered in different locations, creating challenges for investigators attempting to identify a common link. At the beginning, there was no single piece of evidence that immediately connected all of the cases. Instead, investigators had to build a picture from separate investigations, each containing only part of the story. The death of Alicia Greenwade was one of the cases that became central to the investigation. Her body was discovered in Illinois on April 1, 2001. At that time, investigators did not know that her death would eventually become connected to a larger series of suspected crimes. Like any homicide investigation, the initial priority was understanding what happened to her and identifying whoever was responsible. The discovery of her remains represented a tragedy for her family and a challenge for investigators, who had to work with the evidence available. There was no immediate indication that her death was connected to other missing women. The investigation continued, but the larger pattern remained hidden. Approximately 2 months later, the discovery of Betty James's body in Missouri added another disturbing element. The similarities between the cases involving Greenwade and James caused investigators to consider whether they were looking at more than isolated incidents. The possibility that one offender was responsible for multiple deaths became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Still, suspicion alone was not enough. Investigators needed evidence that could connect the crimes to a specific person. They needed something that would move the case beyond a theory and toward a clear suspect. During this period, investigators continued examining other cases involving missing and deceased women. The names connected to Travis would later include Mary Shields, Cassandra Walker, Teresa Wilson, Verona Thompson, Yvonne Cruz, and Brenda Beasley. Each case represented another piece of a larger investigation. The challenge was determining how many of these cases were connected and whether there were other victims who had not yet been identified. Travis himself would later claim that he had killed 17 women, but because he died before trial, investigators never received a complete explanation of those claims. The uncertainty surrounding the number of victims remained one of the most painful unanswered questions in the case. The breakthrough came not from a traditional investigative discovery, but from Travis's own actions. His decision to preserve evidence of his crimes and eventually communicate with the outside world changed everything. When investigators searched his home in Ferguson, Missouri, they discovered evidence that dramatically altered the direction of the investigation. On June 7, 2002, police entered Travis's residence. What they found inside transformed him from a suspect connected to certain crimes into a person investigators believed could be responsible for a much larger series of offenses. Inside the home, investigators discovered restraints, objects believed to have been used to control victims, women's personal belongings, photographs, video recordings, and computer data. The evidence suggested preparation and organization rather than random acts of violence. The discovery of the recordings was among the most significant and disturbing findings. Travis had documented acts of violence against victims, preserving evidence of what investigators believed were his crimes. The recordings provided investigators with a direct connection between Travis and the victims. They also demonstrated a level of planning and control that changed how authorities viewed the case. The evidence suggested that the crimes were not spontaneous events, but involved deliberate actions. In preparation, The discovery of the videos also created an emotional and psychological burden for those involved in the investigation. Reviewing such evidence is one of the most difficult responsibilities law enforcement officers can face. The material was not simply information needed to solve a case. It represented real people suffering through real events. The investigation required officers to confront disturbing evidence while maintaining focus on the responsibility of seeking justice for victims. The house in Ferguson became the center of the investigation. What appeared from the outside to be an ordinary residence contained evidence that investigators believed connected Travis to multiple crimes. The contrast was shocking. A place that represented everyday life had become the location where investigators uncovered some of the most important evidence in the case. The search also revealed how much remained unknown. Even with the evidence recovered, investigators still had questions. How many victims were there? When did the crimes begin? Were there additional locations connected to Travis? Could every unidentified victim be named and returned to their families? The discovery inside the home answered some questions, but created many others. As investigators processed the evidence, another critical piece of the case emerged: the letter that would ultimately reveal how Travis had exposed himself. In an unusual move, the person investigators believed was responsible for the crimes appeared to want recognition. The letter sent to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch would become the mistake that changed the entire investigation. Travis had spent years keeping his alleged actions hidden, but in seeking to demonstrate control, he created a trail that investigators could follow. The letter, the digital information connected to it, and the evidence inside his home would soon combine to provide authorities with the opportunity to move against him. The man who investigators believed had carefully hidden his crimes had left behind the very evidence needed to find him. The investigation was no longer searching for an unknown offender. It was now focused on Maury Travis, and the next stage of the case would reveal how a single act of arrogance became the beginning of the end for the man known as the Bi-State Strangler. The investigation into Maury Travis changed forever because of a decision that, in another circumstance, might have appeared insignificant. A single letter sent to a newspaper would become the key that connected investigators to a suspect they had been searching for a man who had remained hidden behind an ordinary public image. The desire to reveal what he knew became the mistake that brought law enforcement closer to him. The letter did not come from a witness, a victim's family member, or someone reporting suspicious activity. It came from someone who appeared to possess information about the crimes themselves. In June 2002, a reporter at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch received a letter from an unknown sender. The writer claimed to have knowledge of the murders that had been troubling investigators and suggested information that appeared to come from someone directly connected to the crimes. The letter was not simply a message providing details. It appeared to be an attempt to challenge investigators and demonstrate control over information they did not yet possess. Within the letter, the sender included a map and referred to what was described as victim number 17. The implication was clear. The writer wanted authorities to believe that he knew about additional victims and locations connected to the case. For investigators, this immediately raised important questions. Who would send such a letter? Why would someone voluntarily draw attention to themselves? Was this a person seeking attention, someone attempting to mislead the investigation, or the individual responsible for the crimes? The letter created a new direction for the case. Investigators began examining the information carefully, not only for what it revealed about the crimes, but also for clues about who had created it. The sender appeared confident, perhaps believing that he could control how much information investigators received and how they interpreted it. But that confidence created an opportunity. Every communication leaves traces, and in this case, the technology involved in creating the letter would become one of the most important pieces of evidence. Investigators examined the map included with the letter. Rather than treating it only as a physical clue, they looked at how it had been created. The map had been generated using an online mapping service. This meant that digital information existed behind the document. The investigators followed that information, tracing the source of the map and examining where it had originated. The investigation eventually led them to a computer inside Maury Travis's home. The discovery represented a major turning point. The person who had attempted to demonstrate knowledge of the crimes had unknowingly provided investigators with a path directly toward him. Technology had become the link between the anonymous letter and a specific individual. The digital evidence did not exist in isolation. It became part of a larger collection of information that investigators had gathered while examining the cases connected to Travis. The letter strengthened the connection between him and the investigation. It was no longer only a question of whether Travis might be involved. Investigators now had a reason to focus their attention on him. On June 7, 2002, law enforcement moved forward with a search of Travis's home in Ferguson, Missouri. The search represented the moment when years of uncertainty began to change into a clearer understanding of what investigators believed had happened. Inside the residence, officers found evidence that suggested Travis was connected to multiple crimes. Among the items recovered were a personal computer, restraints, objects believed to have been used in controlling victims, video recordings, and biological evidence. Each piece contributed to the growing picture of the investigation. The computer was especially important because it represented both a connection to the letter and a source of additional information. The recordings discovered during the search were among the most significant pieces of evidence. Investigators found that Travis had preserved videos documenting violence against victims. These recordings provided information that authorities believed directly connected him to the crimes. They demonstrated not only the alleged acts themselves, but also the level of preparation and control involved. The evidence suggested that Travis had not acted randomly. Investigators believed he had created a private record of his crimes, preserving evidence of what he had done. The discovery was deeply disturbing for those involved in the investigation. Law enforcement officers are trained to process difficult evidence, but some discoveries remain difficult even for experienced investigators. The recordings were not simply objects in an investigation file. They represented real victims and real suffering. The focus of the investigation remained on identifying victims, understanding what happened, and building a complete picture of the crimes. The search of Travis's home also provided evidence connected to the cases of Alicia Greenwade and Betty James. Travis was arrested in connection with kidnapping and murders involving those victims. Investigators believed that the evidence recovered from the home could support a much broader investigation. But at the moment of his arrest, the legal case focused on the charges they could establish. The arrest marked a significant moment for investigators and for the families of victims. After years of uncertainty, authorities had identified a person that they believed was responsible. But the arrest did not answer every question. Instead, it opened a new phase of the investigation. Detectives still needed to understand the full scope of Travis's actions. They needed to determine how many victims were connected to him and whether additional unidentified cases could be solved. The evidence suggested a larger pattern, but many details remained unclear. Travis's own statements complicated the situation. He claimed responsibility for killing 17 women, but investigators could not verify every claim. Because the number of confirmed victims was smaller than the number he suggested, authorities faced the challenge of separating evidence from statements that could not be independently proven. Without a trial, there would be no opportunity to question him under oath or examine those claims in court. The investigation into Maury Travis demonstrated a recurring challenge in complex criminal cases. Finding the truth requires more than identifying a suspect. It requires understanding the full impact of the crimes, identifying victims, establishing facts, and providing answers to those affected. The arrest provided investigators with a suspect, but it did not provide closure. In many criminal cases, the courtroom becomes the place where evidence is presented and questions are answered. Prosecutors present their case, defense attorneys challenge the evidence, witnesses testify, and a verdict determines legal responsibility. But in the case of Maury Travis, that process would never happen. Only days after his arrest, before investigators could complete their work, and before the victims' families could hear the evidence presented publicly, Travis's life would come to an end. The man who had drawn attention to himself, who had provided investigators with the path leading to his arrest, would never face a jury. The justice system would never have the opportunity to fully examine the evidence against him in court. The investigation had reached a critical point, but the final chapter would unfold in a way that left many questions unanswered. The letter that exposed Travis had solved one mystery. It helped identify the person investigators believed was responsible. But it could not reveal everything. It could not explain every disappearance. It could not provide every family with the answers they deserved. The case had moved from uncertainty to discovery, but complete resolution remained out of reach. Maury Travis had wanted to control the story of his crimes. Instead, his own actions created the evidence that led investigators to him. Yet the most important stories in the case were not about the man who committed the crimes. They belonged to the victims, whose lives and identities remained at the center of an investigation that would continue even after Travis was gone. The arrest of Maury Travis represented a moment that investigators had been working toward for years. After a long process of examining missing persons cases, connecting evidence, and searching for the person they believed was responsible, authorities finally had a suspect. The investigation had moved from uncertainty into a new phase. There was now a name, a location, and a collection of evidence that investigators believed connected Travis to multiple crimes. But the arrest was only the beginning of what would normally become the next stage of a major criminal case. The evidence would be examined in court. Prosecutors would present their arguments. The defense would challenge the accusations. Families of victims would have the opportunity to hear the details of the case in a public trial. But none of that would happen. Maury Travis would never stand before a judge or a jury. The answers investigators hoped to obtain would disappear with him. On June 7, 2002, authorities arrested Maury Travis after searching his home in Ferguson, Missouri. The investigation had been transformed by the evidence discovered inside the residence. What officers found suggested a connection between Travis and the deaths of multiple women. The items recovered included restraints, personal belongings believed to belong to victims, video recordings, computer evidence, and biological material. Together, these discoveries created a picture that investigators believed showed planning, control, and direct involvement in violent crimes. Travis was arrested in connection with kidnapping and murders involving Alicia Greenwade and Betty James. These were among the cases that investigators believed they could directly connect to him. The evidence gathered during the search provided the foundation for potential criminal charges, and authorities prepared to continue examining the larger investigation surrounding him. However, even after his arrest, many questions remained unanswered. Investigators wanted to know how many victims were connected to Travis. They wanted to determine when the crimes had begun and whether there were additional locations or evidence that had not yet been discovered. They also wanted to understand the full story behind the women whose lives had been taken. An arrest could identify a suspect, but it could not automatically reveal the entire truth. In complex investigations involving multiple victims, the process of uncovering answers often continues long after a suspect is taken into custody. Detectives must verify evidence, identify victims, establish timelines, and determine the extent of the offender's actions. In Travis's case, the evidence suggested that the investigation might involve more victims than those already identified. His own claims added another layer of uncertainty. Travis reportedly claimed that he had killed 17 women. Investigators considered his statements, but they could not confirm every claim. The distinction between what a suspect says and what investigators can prove is one of the most important aspects of criminal investigation. Evidence must be examined carefully, and conclusions must be based on facts that can be established. Because Travis would never go to trial, the opportunity to question him about those claims was lost. A trial often provides a structured process for examining evidence and seeking answers. Prosecutors can present information collected during the investigation. Witnesses can describe what they know. Experts can explain evidence. The defense has the opportunity to challenge the prosecution's case. Through that process, a complete public record can be created. For the victims' families, a trial can also represent an opportunity to hear the truth about what happened. In the case of Maury Travis, that process ended before it began. Only 3 days after his arrest, Travis was found dead in his jail cell. On June 10, 2002, while being held in the St. Louis County Jail, Maury Travis died by suicide. He had hanged himself inside his cell. His death immediately changed the direction of the investigation. The person authorities believed could provide the most direct answers was no longer available. The investigators who had spent years searching for the person responsible were left with evidence, but without the opportunity to question him further. The circumstances surrounding his death also created controversy. Travis had been placed under suicide watch because of concerns about the possibility that he might harm himself. However, reports indicated that required checks were missed, creating the opportunity for him to carry out the act. The situation raised questions about procedures for monitoring inmates considered at risk and whether different actions could have prevented his death. Beyond those procedural questions, his suicide created a much larger problem for the investigation. The case had been approaching the point where evidence could be tested in court, but instead, it ended with the suspect's death. For many families connected to the victims, there was no trial, no testimony, and no opportunity to hear Travis explain what happened. The evidence recovered from his home remained, but the person who could provide additional information was gone. The death of Travis meant that some questions would likely never be answered. Investigators had evidence suggesting he was responsible for multiple crimes, but they could not know with certainty how many victims were connected to him. They could not fully determine when the crimes began. They could not confirm whether every disappearance linked to him had been identified. They could not ask him about locations, victims, or details known only to him. These unanswered questions became one of the defining aspects of the case. The investigation had achieved an important goal, identifying a suspect and recovering evidence. But it had not achieved complete understanding. In many criminal cases, the legal process provides a final conclusion. A conviction establishes responsibility, and a sentence represents the punishment imposed by the justice system. The Maury Travis case ended differently. There was no conviction. There was no sentencing hearing. There was no final statement from the accused. Instead, the case remained defined by evidence left behind and questions that could not be resolved. The women connected to the investigation remained at the center of that uncertainty. Their families had to face the reality that the person believed responsible would never answer their questions in court. The evidence revealed information about the crimes, but it could not replace the explanations that only Travis could have provided. The case also demonstrated the challenges faced by investigators working with vulnerable victims and complex patterns of crime. The women connected to Travis were often individuals whose disappearances did not immediately receive widespread attention. Their cases required investigators to look carefully at connections that were not obvious at first. The investigation showed how important it is to examine every missing person case with seriousness and care, regardless of a person's background or circumstances. The story of Maury Travis ended earlier than investigators expected, but the impact of the case continued. The evidence recovered from his home ensured that the investigation would not simply disappear. The recordings, computer information, and physical evidence provided a record of what investigators believed had occurred. Future efforts to identify victims and understand unresolved cases continued based on that evidence. But the absence of a trial remained a significant loss. A courtroom would have allowed the evidence to be examined publicly, and would have given families the opportunity to hear the case presented in full. Instead, the investigation ended with uncertainty. Maury Travis wanted control over the story of his crimes. He attempted to communicate, to reveal information, and to demonstrate that he possessed knowledge investigators did not have. That confidence ultimately helped expose him, but his death ensured that he would never fully explain the extent of what he had done. The investigation found the person believed responsible, but it never found every answer. The arrest brought a suspect into custody, but the truth remained incomplete. The trial that investigators expected to pursue never happened, and the families of the victims were left with evidence of what had occurred, but without the final explanations they deserved. The death of Maury Travis brought the legal process to an abrupt end, but it did not bring an end to the questions surrounding his crimes. In many investigations, the arrest of a suspect is only one step toward understanding the full truth. Investigators must continue gathering evidence, identifying victims, reconstructing events, and presenting their findings through the justice system. In the case of Maury Travis, that process was interrupted before it could fully unfold. The evidence remained, the victims remained, and the unanswered questions remained. What ended was the possibility of hearing those answers directly from the person investigators believed was responsible. For the families connected to the case, the conclusion was incomplete. They had learned the identity of the person believed to have caused their loss, but they never received the full explanation that a trial might have provided. They never had the opportunity to hear testimony describing exactly what happened, why certain victims were targeted, or whether there were other women whose names had not yet been connected to the investigation. The case of Maury Travis became one of the most difficult examples of an investigation that uncovered significant evidence but could never achieve complete resolution. One of the greatest remaining questions was the true number of victims. Investigators believed Travis could have been responsible for more deaths than those that were confirmed. His own statement suggested that he had killed 17 women, but authorities could not independently verify every claim. In criminal investigations, statements from suspects must be carefully examined and supported by evidence. A confession or claim alone does not automatically establish the truth. Investigators must determine whether information can be confirmed through physical evidence, witness accounts, records, or other reliable sources. Because Travis died before trial, authorities lost the ability to question him further about these claims. The number of possible victims remained uncertain. Estimates connected to Travis range from approximately 12 to 20 women, but the exact number has never been fully established. This uncertainty represents one of the most painful aspects of the case. Every unidentified victim represents a person whose story may remain incomplete. It also represents a family that may still be searching for answers. Investigators were left with the difficult task of reviewing evidence and attempting to determine whether other missing women could be connected to Travis. The investigation did not simply end when Travis died. Evidence continued to provide information about the crimes and the possible victims. The recordings, computer data, and physical items recovered from his home created a record of the investigation. They allowed authorities to examine connections that might not have been obvious before his arrest. Years after the case first gained public attention, advances in forensic methods continued to provide opportunities to identify victims who had previously remained unknown. This demonstrated an important reality in criminal investigations. Some cases continue long after the original investigation appears to have ended. Technology, improved forensic techniques, and renewed examination of evidence can provide answers that were not possible at the time. The Maury Travis case also became an example of how digital evidence has transformed modern investigations. The letter sent to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch was a critical moment because it showed how technology could reveal the identity of someone attempting to hide. Travis appeared to believe that he could control the investigation by choosing what information to reveal. Instead, the digital trail connected the communication back to his own computer. The technology he used as a tool of confidence became a tool for investigators. This aspect of the case represented a broader change in law enforcement. Digital information increasingly became an important part of criminal investigations, allowing investigators to trace actions that previously might have remained anonymous. But the case was not only about technology or evidence. At its center were the victims. One of the most important lessons from the Maury Travis investigation was the importance of recognizing the value of every missing person. Many of the women connected to Travis lived difficult lives and faced serious personal challenges. However, those circumstances did not make their disappearances less important. Their lives mattered, and their cases deserved attention and investigation. The circumstances surrounding a victim's life should never determine whether their disappearance receives concern. The investigation highlighted how offenders can exploit vulnerability. People who are isolated, struggling, or less visible within society may be targeted because criminals believe they are less likely to be immediately noticed. This does not make those individuals responsible for what happened to them. Instead, it shows the importance of ensuring that every person receives protection and that every disappearance is treated seriously. The case also demonstrated how a criminal investigation can remain unfinished even when the suspect has been identified. Traditionally, many people associate justice with a courtroom outcome, a trial, a verdict, and a sentence. But the Maury Travis case showed that discovering the identity of a suspect does not always provide complete closure. A legal conclusion and a complete understanding are not always the same thing. Investigators may know who they believe committed the crimes while still not knowing every detail about those crimes. The families of victims may know who caused their suffering while still being left with unanswered questions. The community may understand what happened while still struggling with the reality that some parts of the story will never be known. The legacy of Maury Travis is therefore complicated. He became known because of the crimes investigators connected to him, but the lasting importance of the case comes from what it revealed about victims, investigations, and the justice system. The case demonstrated the importance of connecting individual investigations, especially when victims come from vulnerable populations. It showed how technology can play a decisive role in solving crimes. It also showed the limitations of justice when the person at the center of an investigation dies. Before facing trial, Maury Travis attempted to create a lasting record of his crimes. He preserved evidence and sent a message that appeared intended to demonstrate control. But the result was different from what he may have expected. The evidence he left behind helped investigators uncover the truth about many aspects of the case. His attempt to challenge authorities ultimately became one of the reasons they were able to identify him. However, the final story does not belong to Maury Travis. The focus of the case should remain on the women whose lives were taken and the families who were left searching for answers. The names connected to the investigation represent more than a criminal case. They represent people who had their own experiences, relationships, and futures. The work of investigators was not simply about proving what Travis had done. It was also about restoring identities to victims whose stories had been overshadowed by the actions of the person accused of harming them. The Maury Travis case remains one of the most disturbing investigations in St. Louis history because it contains both discovery and uncertainty. Investigators found evidence that revealed a hidden world inside an ordinary home. They identified a suspect. They uncovered connections between separate cases. But they never had the opportunity to hear the complete story from the person they believed responsible. In the end, Maury Travis wanted to be remembered as someone who controlled the situation. He wanted to decide what information was revealed and when it was revealed. Instead, his own actions became the reason investigators found him. His confidence created evidence. His attempt to challenge authorities created a trail. And his death left behind a case that could be solved in part, but never completely understood. The story of Maury Travis is ultimately a reminder that behind every investigation are human lives. The evidence tells part of the story, but the victims tell the reason the story matters. Their names, their experiences, and their families' search for answers remain the most important part of the case. The investigation may have ended, but the questions left behind continue to remind us that justice is not only about finding the person responsible. It is also about remembering those who were lost. When Maury Travis died 3 days after his arrest, the investigation entered a unique and difficult stage. Law enforcement had identified the person they believed was responsible for a series of violent crimes. But the individual who could provide direct explanations was no longer available. The evidence recovered from his home became the foundation of the investigation's remaining work. Instead of relying on a confession or testimony, investigators had to examine what Travis had left behind and use those materials to reconstruct the events they believed had taken place. The case became a study of how physical evidence, digital information, and investigative connections can reveal the truth even when the suspect is no longer present. However, evidence could answer only some questions. It could show connections, establish patterns, and provide important information. But it could not replace the words of the person who created it. It could not explain motivations, confirm every victim, or provide the complete timeline that investigators wanted to understand. This limitation became one of the defining features of the Maury Travis investigation. The search of Travis's Ferguson home revealed a collection of evidence that shocked investigators. The residence, which appeared ordinary from the outside, contained items that suggested a hidden reality. Among the discoveries were restraints, objects believed to have been used to control victims, personal belongings belonging to women, photographs, video recordings, and computer data. Each item represented another piece of a much larger investigation. The evidence suggested that Travis had not simply been connected to isolated incidents. Instead, investigators believed the material showed preparation, organization, and a repeated pattern of behavior. The most significant discoveries were the video recordings. These recordings became some of the strongest evidence connecting Travis to the crimes. They showed that he had documented violent acts against victims, creating a record of what investigators believed were his actions. The existence of these recordings changed the nature of the investigation. Without them, authorities might have relied primarily on circumstantial evidence, connections between victims, and physical findings. The videos provided investigators with direct information about Travis's involvement. However, their importance also came with a heavy emotional burden. Evidence in a criminal case is not just an object. It represents real events and real people. For investigators, reviewing such material meant confronting the suffering experienced by victims. The responsibility was not only to analyze evidence, but also to maintain focus on the purpose of the investigation. Seeking justice for the women whose lives had been taken, the discovery of the recordings also provided insight into the level of control investigators believed Travis sought. The evidence suggested that he wanted to preserve his actions and maintain possession of the memory of what had happened. This behavior became an important part of how investigators understood the case. The crimes were not viewed as random acts, but as actions involving planning and control. The evidence suggested that Travis had created a private record of violence while continuing to maintain the appearance of a normal life in public. The computer evidence was another critical part of the investigation. The same technology that helped investigators connect Travis to the letter sent to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch also provided additional information about the case. The letter had been an unusual moment because it appeared that Travis wanted to communicate with investigators and demonstrate that he possessed information they did not have. Instead, the digital trail created by that communication became one of the reasons authorities focused on him. This moment illustrated a central theme of the case. The person investigators believed responsible was ultimately exposed by his own decisions. The investigation also raised questions about how long Travis may have been active before he was identified. Authorities believed he could have been connected to crimes beyond those that were confirmed. The names associated with the investigation included Alicia Greenwade, Betty James, Mary Shields, Cassandra Walker, Teresa Wilson, Verona Thompson, Yvonne Cruz, and Brenda Beasley. Each case represented a different investigation, but together they formed the larger picture that investigators were attempting to understand. The possibility that additional victims existed remained one of the most significant unanswered questions. Travis's own claim that he had killed 17 women suggested a larger number, but investigators could not confirm every statement. Without a trial, there was no opportunity to question him about the details behind those claims. This created a situation where evidence provided some answers while leaving others unresolved. The investigation also highlighted challenges in cases involving vulnerable victims. Many of the women connected to Travis were individuals who faced difficult circumstances. Some were involved in street prostitution or struggled with instability. These factors created additional challenges in identifying patterns and connecting cases. When multiple disappearances involve individuals who have limited public visibility, there is a risk that connections may take longer to recognize. The Maury Travis case demonstrated the importance of treating every missing person investigation with seriousness and attention. A person's circumstances do not determine the value of their life. The women connected to the case were not simply victims in an investigation. They were individuals with personal histories, relationships, and identities beyond the circumstances that brought them into the case. Another important aspect of the investigation was the cooperation required across different jurisdictions. Because the suspected crimes occurred in both Missouri and Illinois, investigators had to consider information from multiple locations. The name Bi-State Strangler reflected this geographic element. The investigation required authorities to look beyond individual cases and recognize that crimes occurring in different places could be connected to the same person. This type of cooperation is often essential in investigations involving serial offenders. Without the ability to compare information and identify patterns, separate cases may remain disconnected. The Maury Travis investigation demonstrated how a broader perspective can reveal connections that are not immediately obvious. The case also became an example of the changing role of technology in law enforcement. The letter that led investigators to Travis showed how digital evidence could transform an investigation. A person attempting to remain anonymous could leave behind information that reveals their identity. The internet provided Travis with a way to communicate, but it also provided investigators with a way to trace that communication. Technology did not solve every mystery in the case, but it played a decisive role in identifying the suspect. Despite the evidence recovered, the investigation could never provide complete closure. The absence of a trial meant that many details remained outside public examination. There was no courtroom presentation where prosecutors could explain the evidence, no defense argument challenging the accusations, and no verdict establishing legal responsibility. Instead, the case ended with investigative conclusions rather than a judicial decision. This distinction is important. Investigators believed Travis was responsible based on the evidence they uncovered. But because he died before trial, there was never a legal determination through the court system. For the families of victims, the lack of a trial created a different kind of loss. They knew investigators had found the person believed responsible, but they never experienced the process of seeing that person held accountable in court. They never heard a final explanation from him. They never received answers to every question. The evidence remained, but the conversation that might have occurred in a courtroom never happened. The Maury Travis case remains significant because it demonstrates both the power and the limits of evidence. Investigators were able to uncover a hidden reality, identify connections between victims, and reveal the actions of a suspected offender. But evidence could not replace the information lost when Travis died. It could not answer every question about the women whose lives were taken. It could not provide the complete story. In the years following the investigation, The case continued to serve as a reminder of the importance of victim-centered investigations, careful examination of evidence, and cooperation between law enforcement agencies. The discoveries inside Travis's home ensured that the crimes would not remain unknown. But they also showed the painful reality that some investigations, even when they identify a suspect, may never provide every answer. The evidence told a significant part of the story. The victims' names gave that story meaning, and the unanswered questions showed the lasting impact of a case that ended before the truth could ever be fully revealed. Years after the arrest and death of Maury Travis, the case remained a painful reminder that some investigations do not end when a suspect is identified. In many criminal cases, the discovery of a suspect is considered the moment when uncertainty begins to disappear. Investigators can explain what happened, prosecutors can present evidence, and families can finally hear the complete story. But the Maury Travis case followed a different path. Authorities believed they had found the person responsible for a series of violent crimes, but his death prevented them from obtaining the answers that only he could provide. The investigation revealed a disturbing amount of evidence, yet it also left behind a long list of unanswered questions. The greatest question was the number of victims. How many women had actually been killed by Maury Travis? The answer remains uncertain. Investigators connected him to several confirmed victims, but they believe the total number could have been much higher. Travis himself claimed that he had killed 17 women. However, law enforcement could not confirm every statement he made. A suspect's claims, even when they appear to contain information about crimes, must be carefully examined and supported by evidence. Investigators could not simply accept every statement as fact. They had to determine which cases could be connected through reliable evidence. Because Travis died before he could be questioned further, many possible answers disappeared with him. The uncertainty surrounding the number of victims created a painful situation for families of missing women. For some families, the possibility remained that their loved one could have been among those connected to Travis. Without complete information, they were left with uncertainty. A name, a photograph, and a memory were all they had, while investigators continued searching for connections between unresolved cases and the evidence recovered from Travis's home. The women connected to the investigation included Alicia Greenwade, Betty James, Mary Shields, Cassandra Walker, Teresa Wilson, Verona Thompson, Yvonne Cruz, and Brenda Beasley. These names became part of the public record because of the crimes associated with Travis, but their identities represented much more than an investigation. Each woman had a life before becoming part of a criminal case. Each had personal experiences, relationships, and a history that existed beyond the circumstances of their deaths. One of the challenges in cases involving vulnerable victims is that their stories can sometimes become overshadowed by the actions of the offender. The focus often shifts toward the person who committed the crimes, the methods used, and the investigation that followed. But the victims are the central reason the investigation mattered. The purpose of solving a crime is not only to identify an offender. It is also to acknowledge the lives lost and provide answers to those left behind. The Maury Travis investigation demonstrated how offenders may exploit vulnerability. Many of the women connected to the case were individuals who faced difficult circumstances, including instability, addiction, or involvement in street prostitution. These circumstances made them easier targets for someone seeking to avoid detection. Their disappearances did not always immediately receive the attention they deserved, and that created opportunities for Travis to continue operating. However, the circumstances of a person's life never reduce the importance of that person's existence. The investigation into Travis highlighted the need for a broader understanding of missing persons cases. Every disappearance represents a person whose absence affects others. Every missing person deserves investigation and attention. When individuals live on the margins of society, they can become more vulnerable not only to crime, but also to being overlooked afterward. The case became an example of why law enforcement must continue looking for connections between cases, even when victims appear to come from different backgrounds or circumstances. Another unanswered question involved the timeline of Travis's crimes. Investigators believed that he may have been responsible for crimes beyond those confirmed between 2000 and 2002. However, the exact beginning of his criminal activity remained unknown. Without his testimony, investigators could only rely on evidence available to them. They could examine physical items, digital records, and connections between cases, but they could not ask him when the crimes began or how many events had occurred. This limitation created a permanent gap in the investigation. The same uncertainty applied to possible locations connected to the crimes. Travis had provided information suggesting additional victims, including the reference to a supposed victim number 17 in the letter that helped expose him. But after his death, investigators could not receive clarification from him directly. They had to continue examining evidence and determining which information could be verified. The case also raised important questions about how society recognizes victims. The women connected to Travis were often individuals who did not have the same level of public attention as victims from other backgrounds. Their disappearances were more difficult to immediately connect because their lives were already complicated by personal challenges. This vulnerability became part of the pattern investigators identified. The case demonstrated how important it is to ensure that every victim receives equal attention and that every family searching for answers is taken seriously. In the years following Travis's death, advances in forensic technology provided new opportunities to revisit unresolved cases. Methods that were unavailable during the original investigation could later help investigators examine evidence in new ways. Some victims who had previously remained unidentified were later recognized through improved forensic approaches, showing that investigations can continue even after many years. This aspect of the Travis case demonstrated the evolving nature of criminal investigation. A case may appear to have reached its conclusion, but new technology can reopen questions and provide answers that were previously impossible. The continuing examination of the evidence also showed that justice is not always limited to a courtroom. While Travis never faced trial, efforts to identify victims and understand the full scope of the crimes continued. Investigators, forensic specialists, and others involved in reviewing evidence worked toward a goal that extended beyond prosecution, understanding what happened and giving names back to those who had been lost. The absence of a trial remained one of the defining features of the case. A courtroom could have provided a public examination of the evidence. Prosecutors could have presented the recordings, physical evidence, and digital information. Witnesses could have described their experiences. The defense could have challenged the accusations. A verdict could have provided a formal legal conclusion. Instead, the case ended with investigative findings rather than a judicial decision. This created a complicated legacy. Authorities believed the evidence clearly connected Travis to multiple crimes, but the legal process never reached its final stage. The story of Maury Travis therefore remains both a solved and unsolved case. The identity of the suspected offender became known. Significant evidence was discovered. Connections between victims were established, yet the complete truth remained incomplete. The person believed to have had the answers was gone, leaving investigators and families with only the evidence he left behind. Ultimately, the most important legacy of the case is not the name Maury Travis. It is the reminder that behind every criminal investigation are real people whose lives matter. The women connected to the case were not defined by how they became victims. They were individuals who had their own stories, relationships, and experiences. Their names should remain at the center of the discussion. The investigation into Maury Travis revealed a hidden world, exposed a dangerous offender, and answered many questions. But it also demonstrated that some questions may never receive complete answers. The search for truth continued not because the investigation failed, but because every victim deserved to be remembered and every unanswered question represented someone still searching for closure. The case remains a reminder that solving a crime is not only about finding the person responsible. It is also about honoring those who were lost and ensuring that their stories are never forgotten. The case of Maury Travis remains one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in the history of the St. Louis region, not only because of the crimes investigators connected to him, but because of the unanswered questions that remained after his death. It was a case defined by discovery and uncertainty, by evidence and absence, by the ability of investigators to uncover a hidden reality while never receiving the complete explanation they hoped to find. Maury Travis was identified as the person authorities believed responsible for multiple murders. But he never stood before a court, never faced a jury, and never provided a final account of his actions. The investigation reached a conclusion in one sense, but it never reached complete understanding. The story of Maury Travis began with women whose disappearances did not immediately reveal the larger pattern behind them. These were women living in difficult circumstances, many of whom were vulnerable and less visible within society. Their disappearances were not initially recognized as part of a larger series of crimes. Like many investigations involving multiple victims, the connection was not immediately obvious. Each case existed separately until investigators began identifying similarities and searching for patterns. The discovery that these cases could be connected changed everything. What first appeared to be individual tragedies became part of a much larger investigation. The women were no longer viewed as isolated cases. Their stories became connected through the evidence that led investigators toward Maury Travis. But even as the investigation focused on Travis, the importance of the victims remained the central issue. Their lives were not defined by the circumstances that made them vulnerable. They were people with families, experiences, and identities beyond the crimes that took their lives. A criminal investigation can sometimes become dominated by the person accused of committing the crimes. The offender's name appears in headlines, documentaries, and discussions. The details of the investigation often focus on what the offender did and how authorities discovered the truth. But the purpose of justice is not to create attention for the offender. It is to seek answers for victims and their families. The Maury Travis case serves as a reminder that the victims must remain at the center of the story. The investigation itself contained several elements that made the case unique. One of the most significant was the way Travis was identified. Many criminal investigations are solved through traditional methods, witness testimony, physical evidence, forensic analysis, or investigative work. In this case, one of the most important breakthroughs came because Travis himself created a path for investigators to follow. The letter sent to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch appeared to be an attempt to demonstrate control and knowledge. The writer wanted investigators to believe that he possessed information they did not have. But instead of giving him power over the investigation, the letter became evidence against him. The digital information connected to the map included in the letter allowed investigators to trace the source back to his own computer. The technology he used to communicate ultimately helped reveal his identity. This moment became one of the defining lessons of the case. A person attempting to hide or manipulate an investigation may create the evidence needed to uncover the truth. The search of Travis's home provided another critical turning point. The discovery of restraints, personal belongings, computer data, and video recordings transformed the investigation. The evidence suggested that investigators were not dealing with isolated events but with a person they believed had carefully planned and documented his crimes. The recordings were among the most significant pieces of evidence because they provided investigators with information directly connecting Travis to acts of violence against victims. However, the evidence also represented a painful responsibility. Behind every item collected during the investigation was a real person who suffered. Evidence may help solve crimes, but it also represents the experiences of victims whose lives cannot be restored. The investigation into Maury Travis also demonstrated the challenges involved when a suspect dies before trial. In many cases, the courtroom becomes the place where facts are tested and responsibility is determined. Evidence is presented, witnesses are questioned, and a legal conclusion is reached. But Travis's death ended that process. There was no trial where prosecutors could present the evidence publicly. There was no opportunity for the defense to challenge the accusations. There was no verdict. The legal system could not complete the process it had begun. This did not erase the evidence investigators discovered, but it changed the way the case would be remembered. Without a trial, the public record remained based primarily on investigative findings rather than courtroom proceedings. The absence of a trial also meant that many questions remained unanswered. Investigators believe Travis may have been responsible for more deaths than those confirmed. His own claim that he killed 17 women suggested a larger number of victims. But authorities could not verify every statement. They could not ask him to explain the details. They could not question him about possible unidentified victims. They could not determine whether every missing woman connected to the investigation had been found. The uncertainty surrounding the number of victims became one of the most lasting aspects of the case. It represented not only an investigative challenge, but also a human tragedy. Every unanswered question represented the possibility of another person whose story had not been fully recovered. The case also highlighted the importance of continued investigative work. The death of a suspect does not necessarily mean the search for answers ends. Evidence can continue to be examined. New technology can provide information that was not available before. Advances in forensic methods can help identify victims and connect unresolved cases. The Maury Travis investigation demonstrated that criminal cases can continue evolving long after the original events occur. Years later, new methods helped investigators revisit some of the unanswered questions surrounding unidentified victims, showing that time does not always prevent the possibility of discovery. Beyond the specific details of the investigation, the case revealed broader lessons about crime, vulnerability, and justice. It demonstrated how offenders may target individuals they believe are less likely to receive immediate attention. It showed why every missing person case deserves careful consideration. It emphasized the importance of cooperation between jurisdictions when crimes cross geographic boundaries. And it showed how modern technology can play a decisive role in uncovering hidden information. The term bi-state strangler reflected the geographic nature of the investigation, but the impact of the case extended beyond Missouri and Illinois. It became an example of how law enforcement must look beyond individual incidents and search for connections that may reveal a larger pattern. The case also remains a reminder that a person's public appearance does not always reveal their private actions. Travis lived in a community where he appeared ordinary. He had a job, a home, and relationships. People who encountered him did not necessarily see the person investigators later believed existed behind that image. This contrast between ordinary appearance and hidden behavior is one of the most unsettling aspects of many criminal cases. It challenges assumptions about what danger looks like and reminds investigators that evidence, not appearances, must guide the search for truth. In the end, Maury Travis's attempt to control his own story failed. He appeared to want recognition for his crimes. He wanted to demonstrate that he possessed information others did not have. But the evidence he left behind became the reason investigators were able to identify him. His confidence created a trail that led back to him. Yet despite that discovery, the case never became complete. The person believed responsible was gone before he could answer for what he had done. The final chapter of the Maury Travis case is therefore not about the offender. It is about the victims, the investigation, and the unanswered questions that remain. It is about the families who continued searching for understanding. It is about investigators who worked to connect evidence and identify the truth. It is about the importance of remembering that behind every case file are human lives. The legacy of the Maury Travis investigation is not simply that a suspected serial killer was discovered. Its deeper lesson is that justice involves more than identifying a perpetrator. Justice also means recognizing victims, preserving their stories, and continuing the search for answers even when those answers are difficult to find. Maury Travis died before he could face a courtroom, but the evidence he left behind ensured that the lives of the women connected to the case would not disappear with him. Their stories remain the reason the investigation mattered. Their names remain the most important part of the case, and the search for truth continues as a reminder that every victim deserves to be remembered. Long after the headlines faded and the investigation moved from active pursuit to historical record, the Maury Travis case continued to occupy a difficult place in the history of violent crime in the St. Louis region. Some criminal investigations become remembered because of dramatic courtroom testimony, landmark forensic breakthroughs, or lengthy trials that establish every detail beyond dispute. The Maury Travis investigation followed a different path. Although investigators identified the man they believed was responsible and recovered substantial evidence from his home, the case never reached the courtroom. The legal process ended before it truly began, leaving investigators, victims' families, and the public with both important answers and enduring uncertainty. That combination has become one of the defining characteristics of the case. It serves as a reminder that solving a crime and fully understanding it are not always the same thing. Even after the suspect had died, the responsibility of investigators did not end. Every recovered piece of evidence still required careful examination. Every possible victim deserved to be identified whenever the available evidence allowed. Every unanswered question deserved continued attention, even if complete certainty might never be achieved. Criminal investigations are often viewed as stories with clear endings: an arrest, a conviction, and a sentence. Reality is frequently more complicated. In this investigation, authorities reached the point of identifying the suspect. Yet many of the most important questions remained unanswered because the individual who might have answered them was no longer alive. That reality changed the purpose of the investigation. Instead of preparing primarily for trial, investigators focused on reconstructing events through physical evidence, digital records, recovered belongings, and forensic analysis. The evidence collected inside the Ferguson residence became the permanent record from which much of the investigation would be understood. It represented the closest investigators could come to reconstructing the crimes without the opportunity to question the suspect further. Among the most enduring aspects of the case was the uncertainty surrounding the total number of victims. Maury Travis reportedly claimed responsibility for killing 17 women, but investigators were unable to verify every claim. Law enforcement instead relied on evidence that could be independently supported. This distinction remains essential in responsible criminal investigation. Investigators cannot simply accept every statement made by a suspect. Every allegation must be measured against evidence that can withstand careful examination. Because of that standard, some questions remained unresolved. Authorities believe the number of victims may have ranged between approximately 12 and 20. Yet no definitive total could be established. The uncertainty continues to shape how the case is discussed today. Rather than presenting a single unquestioned figure, investigators have acknowledged the limits of what could be proven. This uncertainty also illustrates the emotional burden carried by families whose loved ones disappeared during the relevant period. Some families received answers through the investigation, while others were left wondering whether their missing relative might somehow be connected to the case. For those families, uncertainty itself became part of the tragedy. The absence of definitive answers can be as painful as the answers themselves. Every unidentified victim represents not only an unfinished investigation, but also an unfinished story. Behind every missing person report is a family waiting for information, hoping that one day uncertainty will give way to truth. The Maury Travis investigation reminds us that identifying victims is one of the most meaningful responsibilities within criminal justice. Giving a victim back their name restores part of the dignity that violence attempted to erase. Another lasting lesson from the investigation concerns the importance of recognizing patterns that might otherwise remain hidden. During the period in which the crimes occurred, the victims largely came from vulnerable circumstances. Some struggled with addiction, some were involved in street prostitution. Many lived lives that exposed them to increased risk, while simultaneously making their disappearances less likely to receive immediate public attention. The investigation demonstrated how dangerous such circumstances can become when a violent offender deliberately targets people whom he believes society may overlook. This lesson extends beyond a single case. It reinforces the principle that every missing person deserves the same careful attention regardless of occupation, financial circumstances, housing status, or personal struggles. Human dignity does not depend upon social status, and neither should the urgency of an investigation. The case also highlighted the increasing importance of digital evidence in modern criminal investigations. The anonymous letter sent to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch appeared intended to display knowledge and control. Instead, it became one of the investigation's most significant breakthroughs. By tracing the digital origin of the accompanying map, investigators were able to connect the communication to Maury Travis's computer. This moment demonstrated how technology can transform criminal investigations. Digital evidence often exists in ways that offenders may not fully appreciate. Information left behind through computers, online services, or electronic communications can establish connections that traditional investigative methods alone might never uncover. The Travis case therefore occupies an important place in discussions about the growing role of digital forensic techniques in law enforcement. Equally significant was the evidence discovered inside Travis's residence. Investigators recovered restraints, personal belongings associated with victims, computer data, photographs, and video recordings that became central to understanding the crimes. Those discoveries reinforced another important principle. Physical evidence frequently speaks more reliably than speculation. Rather than relying on assumptions, investigators built their understanding from items recovered during the lawful search of the residence. Even after the suspect's death, those materials continued to guide investigative efforts. They allowed authorities to compare information across cases, identify connections, and continue searching for victims whose identities had not yet been confirmed. The investigation therefore remained active in important respects even after the suspect could no longer be questioned. Over time, advances in forensic science continued to contribute to that work. As forensic methods improved, investigators gained new opportunities to identify previously unidentified victims and revisit unresolved evidence. According to the case information available, by 2025, some victims who had previously remained unidentified had been identified through modern forensic techniques. That development illustrates an encouraging reality within criminal investigation. Technological progress can continue providing answers years or even decades after a crime originally occurred. Cases that appear dormant are not necessarily forgotten. Evidence preserved today may produce important discoveries tomorrow. The continuing work performed by forensic specialists demonstrates that justice is often a long-term commitment rather than a single event. Yet perhaps the most important legacy of the Maury Travis case lies not in investigative procedure, but in perspective. True crime stories often risk centering attention on offenders while unintentionally pushing victims into the background. Responsible storytelling requires the opposite approach. The lasting significance of this investigation is not that a serial offender sought notoriety or attempted to manipulate investigators through a boastful letter. The lasting significance is that investigators worked to restore names, identities, and dignity to women whose lives had been violently taken. Their stories deserve to be remembered not because of the person accused of harming them, but because every one of them was an individual whose life mattered long before becoming part of a criminal investigation. As this story reaches its conclusion, one fact remains clear. Maury Travis attempted to control the narrative surrounding his crimes. The evidence suggests he wanted recognition and believed he could remain ahead of investigators. Instead, his own actions created the trail that ultimately led authorities to him. Yet even after investigators identified the suspect, the story refused to fit into a simple ending. There was no courtroom testimony, no verdict, and no final confession explaining every unanswered question. There remained only evidence, careful investigative work, and the determination to continue seeking truth wherever the facts could lead. That is ultimately how the Maury Travis case should be remembered, not as a story celebrating the offender, but as a reminder of the importance of patient investigation, responsible use of forensic science, cooperation across jurisdictions, an unwavering commitment to victims whose voices can no longer speak for themselves. The names connected to this investigation remain its most enduring legacy. They remind us that behind every piece of evidence, every investigative report, and every headline stood real people whose futures were stolen. Their memory, rather than the notoriety of the man investigators believed responsible, is what deserves to endure.